statement to me later. "The Laconia Cunard line," responded the steward. "What did she weigh?" was the next question from the submarine. 18,000 tons. What, any passengers? 73, replied Ballin. Men, women, and children. Some of them in this boat. She had over 200 in the crew. Did she carry cargo? Yes. Well, you'll be all right. The patrol will pick you up soon. And without further sound, save for the almost silent fixing of the conning tower lid, the submarine moved off. The appearance of Gibbon's story caused a sensation throughout the United States. It was acclaimed as one of the finest war correspondence pieces of the period and was read from the floor of both houses of Congress, special emphasis being made of the point that the U-boat's captain query as to the identity of his victim proved that Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare policy really meant what it said. With this reputation behind him, Gibbons was not content to sit around at AEF headquarters in Neufchâteau, and he frequently clashed with Palmer over his unauthorized trips and with other, less energetic correspondents over his opinion of them. Lazy louts who won't get out after their own news. He was always intent on being where the real action was, and inevitably he succeeded. In June 1918, with a company of Marines attacking across an open field near Belleau Wood, he raised his head to see what was happening and received a machine gun bullet through his shoulder and another through his left eye. He recovered in the American hospital in Paris and thereafter wore the black eye patch that became his trademark, but the experience had sobered him. He took fewer risks, and the Laconia story remained his best effort of the war. Jimmy Hopper, a shy, small man who wrote for Collier's Weekly, not only got into battle with the 26th Infantry, but took 15 German prisoners as well. He was attempting to enter Cantigny when the Germans, mistaking him for an officer, surrendered. Hopper said he did the only thing that occurred to him. He marched the Germans back to the American lines, bellowing orders like a sergeant major. But then he failed to write the story. His custom, he explained to his colleagues, was to schedule his stories in a methodical fashion in his notebook, and he had yet to write a piece about the personal heroism of a nun. Peggy Hall, a woman war correspondent, paid her own way to Europe because her newspaper, the El Paso Times, could not afford to send her. She was not accredited, but she had one major advantage. She knew General Pershing, having met him while covering his border skirmishes with Pancho Villa, and having won his admiration by marching where the troops marched, sleeping on the ground in a poncho, and yet keeping her blonde, brown-eyed femininity. So, when she reported at his headquarters in France, the usually austere general broke into a big smile, and put out 2 welcoming hands, and said, "Well, Peggy, you're like a breath from home." And soon afterwards, a series of articles, bylined only Peggy, appeared in the Paris edition of the Chicago Tribune and its parent paper in the United States. They dealt with visits to army training camps and made it clear that at one camp the writer had been the personal guest of the commanding general with the permission of Pershing himself. They were neat, offbeat pieces, and other newspapers began to pick up the stories from the Tribune. At first, the correspondents at the press division headquarters in Neufchâteau were intrigued and then angry. They pushed their protest, and unaccredited correspondents being accorded favors as far as GHQ at Chaumont and then to Washington. Neither Peggy Hall's friendship with Pershing nor her popularity with the troops, she wrote the way Ernie Pyle did in the Second World War, low-keyed stories about events in the daily lives of ordinary GIs, could get her properly accredited. For some months, she managed by sharing his pink Vital Pass with Joseph Pearson, a business representative of the Chicago Tribune, and then the Army forbade this also, and Peggy Hall, a victim of her male rivals, was forced to spend the rest of the war in Paris. Irvin Cobb made a second appearance, again for the Saturday Evening Post. His earlier dispatches had made him one of the most widely read American journalists, and as a result he enjoyed more freedom at the front than most of his colleagues did. His appearance, melancholy expression, apple-red cheeks, alligator jaw, fierce eyebrows, and a permanent cigar made him easily recognizable, and the American troops regularly mobbed him. Without exception, they would tell him that they had read his book on his earlier war experiences, speaking of operations, which caused Cobb to remark, "If you guys are telling the truth, then my publishers have held out on me." Cobb, scrupulous about important facts, was not above altering minor ones if it was to his advantage. Harry Hansen of the Chicago Daily News was often with him, but kept quiet for more than 50 years about Cobb's professional methods. We were associated in the march to Marne, almost, and as I was the only man present who could talk with German officers, Cobb would come over and ask, "What did he say?" When I translated, he would laugh heartily. Later on, when I read his reports in the Sunday Evening Post, I discovered that all the remarks had been addressed to him. In one of his books, he describes the most interesting thing that happened to me. Actually, it happened to me. But I bore him no ill will, for I learned much from him about building a readable story. When he wrote his autobiography, Exit Laughing, in 1941, he did give me an oblique credit line. He wrote, "One young man whose name I can't recall," and I believed him. Any attempt to regiment such highly individual journalists as these was clearly going to be difficult, but Palmer, backed by General Pershing, was determined to do so, since a lot of the difficulties of the First World War Corps of American war correspondents encountered were due to the personalities of these two men. It is worth pausing to look a little further at them. Pershing, a West Point graduate, was a martinet who grew furious at the slightest infraction of military regulations. Partly of German descent, the slightest infraction of military regulations, partly he admired. Okay. Pershing, a West Point graduate, was a martinet who grew furious at the slightest infraction of military regulations. Partly of German descent, he admired both the discipline and the war skills of the Germans, and tried to make his troops emulate them. Yet he was a sentimental family man, whose letters to his wife, Frances, usually began, "My darling Frankie," and were generally signed Jackie. It is perhaps his devotion to his wife and children that caused the cold aloofness that had developed by the time he had arrived as Commander-in-Chief of the American Expeditionary Force in 1915, 1 week before his wife, their 3 daughters, and their son were due to join him in El Paso, from where he was conducting his campaign against the Mexican Pancho Villa. He was told by telegram that a fire had destroyed his house and the officers' quarters and at the Presidio in San Francisco, and that his entire family, except his son, Francis, aged 6, had died in it. Pershing took the news without any visible emotion, but within days his hairs whitened, and his mouth acquired a tightness that marked it henceforth. He had few intimates in France, and gave few press conferences and no individual interviews. His treatment of Westbrook Pegler, later to be a famous columnist, was typical. At the time, Pegler, with the United Press, was, at 23, the youngest war correspondent at the American Press headquarters. So when he announced that he was going across to GHQ to demand a personal interview with Pershing, his colleagues merely grinned. Half an hour later, Pegler was back and busy tapping on his typewriter. At length, one of the senior correspondents could contain himself no longer and casually asked Pegler what Pershing had said. Pegler pulled the paper from his typewriter and handed it over. It read, "This correspondent had an interview with General Pershing today. The general said, 'Pegler, get the hell out of my office.'" Pegler's colleagues learned later that this was an entirely accurate report of what had occurred. Meanwhile, Palmer became more and more the army officer, dispensing only the sparsest information and releases, and then usually confining them to laudatory reports on American operations. Since the correspondents were determined to give their reading public the facts about what was happening to their sons, husbands, and brothers in France, trouble was inevitable. It began with the arrival of the first units of the AEF at Saint-Nazaire on the coast of Brittany. Palmer had imposed certain restrictions on American correspondents, including a ban on mentioning the name of the port of arrival until the troops had all landed. Paris-Soir, however, carried a headline announcing the port at Saint-Nazaire. Although the censor had deleted every word from the story underneath, leaving only a blank column, the headline was, of course, enough. It was picked up in London and published there, a clean beat on all the American war correspondents, who began to receive angry cables from their editors. Haywood Brown of the New York Tribune sought to make the best of the situation by sending a descriptive article. He submitted to the censor a dispatch in which the first American soldier down the gangplank was quoted as saying, "Do they allow listed men in the saloons in this town?" Palmer's censors insisted that this was fiction and refused to clear it. Brown admitted that he had used a paraphrase, but argued that this or something like it had happened or could have. Since the censors were in no position to disprove the story, they reluctantly passed it, but it made a note to watch everything Brown sent with particular care. For his part, Brown went about expressing his open contempt for the way the army was running things. "All spit and polish." He succeeded in getting stories passed, even when they included unflattering references to General Pershing, by using phrases that, though cutting, did not violate anything in the censor's handbook. For instance, after it became known that the French soldiers affectionately referred to Marshal Joffre as Papa, Brown sent a cable saying, "Soldiers at the AEF will never call Pershing Papa," and he followed this with his own comment on GHQ at Chaumont, "The American army is doing as well as can be expected." When Palmer pointed out that this sort of remark infringed on the spirit, if not the letter, of the censorship regulations, Brown replied bluntly that he did not consider himself bound in conscience to respect the censorship, since he had signed the correspondence agreement under compulsion. If he had not signed, he would not have been allowed to accompany the army. The feud continued, but Palmer was too busy with another problem to give it his full attention. Some of the senior and most influential war correspondents were threatening to break the story of the supply scandal that had hampered the AEF ever since its landing. Although the full extent of the monumental blunders in supplying the American army did not come to light until after the war, several correspondents knew enough to make things uncomfortable for Pershing and Palmer. The truth was that, although the AEF might not have been the worst armed, worst supplied American army ever fielded, it was certainly in contention for the title. The mobilization effort began with such a ballyhoo had failed on most accounts. The United States finished the war without forwarding a single aircraft to the battle zone, and 4,400 tanks were put under contract for building. Only 15 reached the battle zone, and they arrived after the armistice by January 1918, 8 months after the ending of the war. America had not turned out a single heavy gun because she had neither the tools nor the workmen. But for the arsenal of her allies, the United States would have been unable to fight. Palmer discovered that Janice Wood of the Chicago Daily News, Tom Johnson of the New York Sun, and Herbert Corey of Associated Newspapers had found out about supply shortages. He therefore invited them to Chaumont for a frank talk with Pershing. In front of the three correspondents, Pershing drafted a carefully worded cable to the War Department suggesting that some moderate criticism of the supply difficulties would be preferable to the loss of confidence by the public if the whole story were broken by hostile instead of friendly sources. Pershing's ploy was a clever one. If the department approved, then he planned to allow the three correspondents to write, under Palmer's control, a watered-down story on the supply muddle. If the department did not agree, the correspondents would at least see that it was not Pershing who was muzzling them. The Secretary of War, Newton D. Baker, rejected Pershing's request. His view, suavely conveyed, was that such stories, no matter how moderate in their criticism, would tend to shake confidence in Pershing and his staff. The correspondents could do nothing, and the matter appeared settled. Then, in December 1917, Brown broke the scandal wide open. He packed his bags and returned to New York, breaking his correspondence list, of which breaking his correspondence undertaking, wrote a series of bitter articles for the New York World, the first of which was headlined, "Supply Blunders Hamper First U.S. Units in France." It told of tractors delivered where motorcycles were needed, mules disembarked without harnesses, trucks landed without motors, and urgently needed equipment left behind on the docks. The War Department immediately withdrew Brown's accreditation, and he was fined $10,000 his paper had deposited on his half. Pershing was furious, and for a time considered what further action he could take against Brown. Palmer, however, persuaded him that it would be better to let the matter drop. Censorship was under heavy attack. Westbrook Pegler, although never able to get an interview with Pershing, had found a far more important story. In the harsh winter of 1917 to 1918, he noted with increasing anger the daily funeral processions that moved out of American billets and across the hills around Neufchâteau. He soon found out what caused them. Straggling back from the front line, weary and soaked from the chill rains, the American troops had no warm or dry clothing into which to change. The former sheep barns that housed most of the troops were old and in poor repair. The only heat came from small oil stoves, which burned so poorly that the windows had to be kept open for ventilation. Colds turned into pneumonia, and the death rate rose steadily. Pegler decided that this story would justify breaking censorship, and so, at the suggestion of the United Press's Paris bureau chief, Lowell Mellett, he typed out a long and detailed report listing not only the pneumonia scandal, but every censorship blunder that had occurred since the Saint-Nazaire landing. "Censorship," Pegler wrote, is developing more in the news interest of the military than that of the American reader. Mellett took the report to London personally and gave it to the United Press manager there, Edward L. Keene. Keene, backed by Pegler's view that this was something the American public should know about, and put a summary of the report on the wire addressed to the United Press manager, Roy Howard, in New York. British censors not only stopped the message, but forwarded it to Pershing at Chaumont. Pershing handled the affair carefully. He used Pegler's age as a lever and simply made the official request that the United Press replace him. At 23 he was, Pershing wrote, too youthful and inexperienced. The United Press had little choice in the matter, and Pegler was recalled. By now, censorship had reached almost ludicrous proportions. The correspondents tried to send a story about the cases of wine presented to the Americans, by the French as a gesture of goodwill. The censors vetoed it on the ground that it suggests libelous indulgence by the American soldiers which might offend temperance forces in the United States. Daniel Dillon of the International News Service submitted an expense account to his office and, unable to remember where the money had gone, wrote, "Entertaining General Pershing, $250. The money was not reimbursed, and Dillon, checking in to see what had happened, found that Palmer had taken to censoring expense accounts and had deleted the item. Like Shepard with his story of the Zeppelin raid on London, the American correspondents became adept at beating the censor by turning his own rules against him or by the use of esoteric codes. Wythe Williams in the New York Times was brilliant at this, and his inventiveness gave the Times two notable scoops. The first, in late November 1916, began with the cryptic cable he sent to the newspaper's managing editor, Carl Van Anda, suggesting he should read a recent article by Alden Brooks in Collier's Weekly. Van Anda did so. The article covered the career of General Henry Pétain. Van Anda pondered for a while and queried Williams by cable, "Does Brooks' man want job with us?" Williams answered promptly, "Yes, we dickering with him right now." Van Anda easily deduced that Pétain was involved in some change of command. But what? He cabled Williams again, "Is Brooks' man to have only French branch house or entire firm? In any case, possibly administrative?" Williams replied, "He wants both offices, possibly administrative." The censors read the exchange with some boredom. Obviously, the Times was dickering for the services of some writer, and then the negotiations broke down. Lost it. Alright, so this is what happens when I'm late for supper. The cats get really pushy. And then the negotiations broke down. Williams cabled again. "Think Brooks' man demands too much. Cannot give it to him." Van Anda had almost all he needed. Pétain aspired to lead not only the French High Command, but also the British and Belgian forces on the Western Front. However, the Allies were not... Come on, Flower, chill out. Alright, and that was just a little mini panic attack. However, the Allies were not prepared to give him such wide powers. Another cable from Williams took the story a stage further. "Brooks' man wants too much. Think it best to consider his assistant." A few hours later, he cabled the last link. "Assistant accepts." Van Anda knew the assistant could only be General Nivelle, the commander at Verdun, so he prepared a story, datelined Washington to protect Williams, and ran it on December 7th, 1916. The story said General Joffre's retirement was under consideration and that Nivelle would succeed him. Pétain had originally been considered, but had demanded larger control than France alone could give him. There were furious denials, but the Times stood firm, and 5 days later it had broken the story Paris announced officially, Joffre's retirement and Nivelle's appointment as his successor. By mid-April 1917, Williams was ready for his second scoop. Disillusionment with Novelle's leadership had become apparent, so Williams revived the Brooksman code for an exchange with Van Anda and tipped him off that there had been a renewed offer of the French High Command to Pétain. Pétain had accepted the appointment, and the Times carried the story on April 29th. This time, denials were fewer, the competitors having become wary that after the first story, and as was expected, Pétain's promotion was officially announced on May 15th. Both Williams and Van Anda kept the secret of how the stories had been obtained until some time after the war. Fred Ferguson, a quiet-spoken United Press correspondent sent to France to replace Westbrook Pegler, specialized in using the censorship regulations for his own ends. In May 1918, the press division learned that Captain Archie Roosevelt, a son of the former president, had been wounded in action. Just as quickly, the reporters learned that they were not to publish a word about it until an announcement had been made in Washington. The group of disappointed correspondents broke up and went to Washington. One, Ferguson, lingered. He asked the censor whether it had happened in similar cases. Roosevelt had been awarded the Croix de Guerre. The censor confirmed that he had. "Well," Ferguson said, "I'm going to send that." When the censor protested, Ferguson quoted Regulation 3 of the censorship instruction. Decorations are considered news, can be published by American correspondents. The censor checked with GHQ, which confirmed that Ferguson was within his rights in asking to send such a cable, and his brief message was passed uncut. The story made headlines, and the belated official announcement of Captain Roosevelt's wounding passed almost unnoticed. But Ferguson's biggest scoop, the masterpiece of organization, rather than observation or good writing, came after Palmer had given up the post of press chief and his much more cooperative assistant, Gerald Morgan, had taken over. Congress had started to press for more realistic reporting from the front, and gradually Pershing had been persuaded to accept this view. By this time, Palmer had come to be regarded by his former colleagues as stuffy and out of date, as well as overrated in his earlier eminence as a war correspondent. Palmer, who was in Washington, returned to Chaumont to find that he had been kicked upstairs by being appointed to Pershing's personal staff as an advisor, and that Morgan had been made acting field press chief. Morgan was much more receptive to an unusual idea, and so Ferguson was not worried when he woke Morgan in the early hours of the day. The Americans were to attack the St. Mihiel salient, the first really big operation planned and executed entirely by Americans. Ferguson, the correspondent, and Morgan, the censor, had both attended, a few hours earlier, a detailed briefing on the attack given by Colonel Dennis Nolan, the American intelligence chief. Nolan had described... Come on, stop. Exactly how the attack would be made, hour by hour. It was clear that every precaution had been taken to make certain that it would succeed. No! Fucking knock it off! It was clear that every precaution had been taken to make certain that it would succeed, and this gave Ferguson an idea. While the other correspondents turned in to be ready for a busy day, Ferguson sat down and wrote the story of the battle as if it had already happened. He wrote, following Nolan's outline in brief sections, none longer than about 50 words. Then he took his story to Morgan and asked him to censor it, then and there. "What's the idea?" Morgan said. Ferguson explained. He would leave the already censored copy with Morgan. As intelligence reports came through indicating that each phase of the attack had gone according to plan, all Morgan had to do was to file Ferguson's pre-written section, or take, for him. If something went wrong, Morgan could tear up the brief take that it referred to. Even if half of Ferguson's messages could not be sent, the other half would provide his New York office with enough materials to build up a story. In case the Special Signal Corps wire to Paris became overloaded, Ferguson had made other arrangements. His copy was to go at urgent rates to the post office at Nancy, and then by 4 different world cable routes. If delays or breakdowns stopped any of them, there was a good chance that the others would fill in the gaps at their destination in New York. It was an ingenious, if unusual, plan, and Morgan could find no real reason why he should not go along with it. It worked even better than expected. A press officer conducting 2 correspondents from the Associated Press, Ferguson's rival organization, went off on its own during the battle and left the 2 AP men in Ferguson's car. Ferguson naturally decided that he wanted to see every sector the Americans had captured, and it was 7 p.m. before the worried AP men got back to the telegraph office at Nancy. Their only consoling thought all this time was that their rival, Ferguson, had not been able to send his story either. But when they arrived at the press office, the correspondents already there shouted good-natured abuse at Ferguson. His story had got through, take by take, and had been pushed out to United Press subscribers within a few hours of each phase of the battle. A cable, which every correspondent had already read, awaited Ferguson inside of the office. It was from Roy Howard, the United Press general manager, and it read, "Congratulations on your greatest beat." The end of the war came as a tremendous shock to many Germans. The government had concealed casualties from the public, minimized the effect of America's intervention, and exaggerated the extent of Germany's resources, so that the news of Germany's surrender was difficult to believe. Many Germans, feeling tricked and betrayed, tried to rationalize what had occurred. Philip Gibbs noted, "I became very aware of a myth which persisted in the minds of most Germans and which nothing could alter. Our armies, of course, were never defeated in the field, I heard. It was a stab in the back which betrayed them, revolution from behind by communists and Jews." By 1919, when the press conference assembled at Versailles, this legend, on which the Nazis were to flourish, had become intertwined with German policy. Germany was not going to forget the betrayal. The fatherland would rise from shame. One correspondent saw this attitude at close quarters. It was Burnett Hershey, a Paris representative of the New York Sun. Every newspaper editor in the world wanted a first-hand story of how the Germans were taking their defeat. But the German delegation to the conference, headed by Count Ulrich von Brockdorff-Rantzau, was restricted to the old Hôtel des Reservoirs in Versailles, which was surrounded by a high stockade and guarded by sentries. The stockade connected with another hotel, the Vatel, which housed German press corps. Every morning, the German correspondents would march from the Hotel Vatel to the Hotel des Reservoirs and vanish inside. Hershey devised a scheme for joining them. He bought a pair of striped trousers, a frock coat, a Tyrolean hat, a pair of heavy spectacles, and a shabby dispatch case. In this disguise, he walked up to the sentry at the entrance of the stockade, flashed his Allied press pass, and walked boldly through. Once inside, he waited for the German press corps to come marching past, fell into step with them, and introduced himself to the nearest correspondent. This man was named Wolf of the Berliner Tageblatt. Wolf had a fellow correspondent's admiration for Hershey's nerve and smuggled him past the guard outside the Hotel des Reservoirs. into the press room, where he chatted with the Germans for 2 hours and promised, when he left, to do some shopping for them and to return another day. Hershey brought off his bluff a second time, but still did not succeed in getting what he really wanted to round off his story: an interview with Count von Brockdorff-Rantzau. On the day of the peace treaty was handed to the Germans, every correspondent in Paris was present. They heard Count von Brockdorff-Rantzau, remaining seated and speaking with a defiance and bitterness that angered the Allies, refused to admit Germany's sole guilt for the war. While the other correspondents returned to write about this, Hershey hurried to the Hotel des Reservoirs in his disguise, smuggled himself into the meeting between the German delegation and the German press corps, and got one of the few scoops of the whole peace conference. By accident, he chose a table at what he thought was the back of the room, only to find out that arrangements were reversed and that the seat next to him was occupied by Count von Brockdorff-Rantzau himself. This probably saved him. The Count looked straight ahead, and without realizing that there was an American correspondent in the room, crowded as it was with Germans, made a brief speech. Clemenceau, that senile old man, was with Germans hurling insults at our people, he said. We are not so to be treated. The only way for me to articulate my feelings was deliberately to remain seated. The fatherland has been dealt a heavy blow. There is work to be done. We are Germans. We will not forget. We will rise from this shame. Hershey waited apprehensively until the Count had finished and then left. He hurried back to the press room at the Hotel Crillon in Paris, and, sitting in his frock coat and Tyrolean hat to keep the mood, he wrote his story. That is the end of this chapter. If you enjoyed it, and if you want to help out my channel, please like and subscribe. If you have friends that like to hear about history, I'm definitely interested in doing a focus on that. And there's still a lot of this book left. So I'll see you soon. Bye.